Good evening, everybody. My name is Erik Arneson. Tonight I'm going to be talking about a brief history. I'm going to be talking about Kabbalah. I'm going to be giving a brief history of it. There's a lot of material to pack into this talk. So I've got, 44 slides to cover 1,900 years of history. So some of them might be... so there's going to be omissions. And if you spot omissions and you feel like I shouldn't have omitted something, you should definitely yell at me about it. I will tell you ahead of time that I had a whole slide about Moses Lozado that I just cut out, and we probably won't miss him. But why am I qualified to talk about this? Because I'll tell you something. I'm not Jewish, so I don't actually have formal training in Jewish Kabbalah, but I have been studying the occult since the 1980s, and I started studying Kabbalah in 1998, specifically with Merrill Ward, who was an OTO, who's I think still in the OTO, and he was teaching Kabbalah in my town back then. And then in 2018, I started leading some Kabbalah study groups, which I think went pretty well. I went back through my notes when I was writing this, and I thought my notes were excellent, and I might have been smarter in 2018 than I am now, and we will find out. And then I run the Arnemancy website, blog, and podcast, so you might have seen my stuff there, heard me talk about stuff there. All right, so we are going to talk about a number of things. We're going to talk about precursors of Kabbalah. We're going to talk about the first appearances of Kabbalah and how it originally developed. We're going to talk about Christian Kabbalah. We're going to get into Lurianic Kabbalah a little bit, and then finally we'll wrap up with some talk about Hermetic Qabalah and sort of the modern state, the modern condition of Kabbalah, how it's going. We're also going to talk, I'll give some suggestions for books if there are topics that you are interested in that you want to explore more, or if you want just some basic Kabbalah books. We'll talk about some of the cool, weird stuff, because we're in Dark Star Magick and we should talk about the cool, weird stuff. All right, so before we begin, I'm going to a little note on Hebrew and English. So Hebrew doesn't have the same kind of alphabet that English does. It has letters primarily for consonants, and even those consonant letters can sort of shift and change when they're pronounced. And the vowels are mostly implied. Sometimes they're stated explicitly, but a lot of the times they're not. As a result, when Hebrew is transliterated into English, it ends up in a lot of different forms. So you may hear me say words that you're familiar with from Hermetic Qabalah texts that I am pronouncing in a different way, or that may be spelled in a different way. It is not a misspelling unless I'm misspelling it in Hebrew. But one of the things that I will be doing, and that I don't know how often it shows up in the slides, but I try to kind of stick with this. When I'm talking about Hebrew Kabbalah or Jewish Kabbalah, things that are specifically tied to the Jewish faith and Jewish mysticism, I will spell it on the top row, Kabbalah, a K, a couple of B's, and an H at the end. When I'm talking about Christian Kabbalah, which had a fairly short lifespan compared to a lot of these other traditions, I'll spell it in the middle with a C, Kabbalah. And then Hermetic Qabalah, which will be one of the last subjects we cover, is usually spelled with a Q. So don't get confused. They definitely are different things, but they're also kind of the same thing, or they are close siblings. So just to let you know, Hebrew's different. There will be some Hebrew in the course in this class, but I won't ever have Hebrew on screen without having at least an English transliteration, and I will tell you what it means if I know. And if I don't know, then we can all shrug together.
Or I can try to help transliterate.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, I know some Hebrew. All right. So, first of all, Jewish mysticism has a really long past and a very rich past. And if we go back to the millennium before Kabbalah really developed, there were kind of like two different schools of Jewish mysticism that were happening. The first, Maaseh Bereshit, that translates as the work of creation or the work of Genesis, and was sort of directly related to sort of Talmudic studies and contemplation of the Torah, the Hebrew holy books. The second, the Maaseh Merkava, is translated as the work of the chariot, and was a type, well, it was sort of a school, we sort of use that to refer to a school of texts that were all part of this like kind of intense, really visionary, mystical experience that we'll talk about a little bit here. We find both of these mentioned in the Talmud around this time period. We have probably more information about Maaseh Bereshit than Merkava, but there are Merkava texts around. We'll talk about that a little bit here in a second. But first we have to talk about a great historical and legendary figure who shows up over and over and over again in Jewish myth, especially Jewish myth revolving around mystical traditions, and that's Rabbi Akiva. He lived kind of during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. He's very renowned for his Talmudic knowledge, and he died during the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was, I guess, in 135. There were a lot of he lived in the Middle East, and Rome controlled Judea and Israel, and there were a string of revolts that resulted in lots of deaths and murder and massacres and stuff, and they were kind of bloody. And he died during one of those. But there's this legend around Rabbi Akiva that is really important. And in this legend, Akiva and 3 other rabbis decided to enter into a mystical trance and gaze upon the face of God in a sort of like deep mystical experience that they would all share. But of the 4, only Rabbi Akiva was able to enter Pardes or paradise, and or the sacred garden, and view the face of God. Of the other 3, one of them gazed upon the face of God and just died. One of them gazed upon the face of God and went completely insane, and the last one gazed upon the face of God and apostated and abandoned his faith and became a heretic and like went off into the wilderness. And that story is sort of like important for establishing Rabbi Akiva's sort of legendary credentials as sort of the ultimate Jewish mystic. So also in these times, so a little bit later than that, we have the Hechalot literature, which dealt with these mystical visions of palaces and chariots and gateways that you had to overcome. The Maaseh Merkava was part of this, and the texts would outline these mystical procedures where you would go into these trances and have to like chant divine names, and you'd have visions of these gateways guarded by archangels, and you'd have to speak, divine passwords to pass through them. And it was sort of presented as this extremely dangerous, risky, mystical adventure that could possibly, drive you insane or kill you, as in the Rabbi Akiva myth. And around this time, we also had some other interesting esoteric Jewish literature, like the Book of Enoch, the Sefer HaRazim, which means the Book of Secrets, which is kind of a fun book. You can get translations of it in English now. And all of these were sort of like pre-Kabbalah. They didn't really have a whole lot to do with Kabbalah, and it's hard to say how much of their influence lasted into sort of like the development of Kabbalah. But a fun thing is that there was a ton of Hebraic magic happening. This particular bowl in this picture is an incantation bowl. It's actually written, the letters are too small, so you can't really see, but it's written in Aramaic. It dates from the 4th to 7th century. And And these sorts of things were really common. Like we've got lots of examples of them. Some of them were sort of buried upside down under buildings, but they were basically like magical bowls that sort of kept spirits from haunting houses or were used for other things like that. Sometime in this period, also, there was this very important book called Sefer Yetzirah that was written. Nobody ever agrees on when it was written. It was definitely before the 10th century, but it's like every single time a new translation of it comes out, the scholars who are involved in the translation argue for new time frames and new periods when it was possibly written. Sometimes it's actually attributed to Rabbi Akiva. It sort of has this, it's not a very long text, and it appears in a number of different forms, but it's this sort of like mystical story of creation in which God creates using the Hebrew alphabet. And it splits the Hebrew alphabet up into groups where you have 3 mothers, 7 doubles, and 12 elementals. The letters are tied to like parts of the body, to different directions, to astrological concepts, to the elements, things like that. But it also, the Sefer Yetzirah introduces some meditative practices that are far safer than the Maaseh Merkabah. But it's also still not a Kabbalistic text. For instance, it does introduce the Sephirot, where if you ever see a tree of life diagram, I'm sure there's one in like half the books in this room. But the tree of life has those 10 spheres on it, arranged in triangles and connected by lines. Each of those spheres is a sephirah. Together they are sephirot. The Sefer Yetzirah doesn't really treat them in the same way as Kabbalah does, but it's definitely where the concept sort of originates and comes from. Another really important early text that was written before the 12th century, but we don't know when, is the Sefer HaBahir. This is possibly written by a 12th century mystic named Isaac the Blind, but we don't really know for sure. It was probably first made public in about 1176, but again, we don't know for sure. It has some Torah commentary. It has the Hebrew alphabet is treated as sort of a very special mystical thing, kind of like the Sefer Yetzirah, and maybe even inspired by it. Again, there's a focus on the Sephirot, and it also talks a little bit about transmigration of the soul, which is a Kabbalistic theme that we'll get into a little later. But again, Sefer HaBahir might actually predate Kabbalah, and it might not actually literally be a Kabbalistic text. All right, so then we start to get into some stuff that scholars call Kabbalah, that we're sort of like, oh yes, this is absolutely Kabbalah. So the earliest region that this sort of occurred in was Al-Andalus, which was in the Moorish-controlled Spain. There was a Jewish mystic named Solomon ibn Gabriel who incorporated a lot of Neoplatonic thought into his sort of like mystical writings about Judaism. It's important to understand that since Kabbalah happened sort of in a Semitic or an Arabic world, it still had access to Plato and Neoplatonic works. All of this stuff had kind of been lost in the Latin-speaking world. So the Catholics didn't really have this stuff until a few centuries later, but Islamic scholars and Jewish scholars still had access to kind of like the full gamut of Greek philosophy. This is also sort of the first place where we see the word Kabbalah used. Abraham ibn David wrote Sefer HaKabalah, but it wasn't a word referring to a mystical tradition as much as it was a word referring to traditions that were being passed down. But also during this period of time, we'll talk about a couple of the characters during this, or historical characters during this period of time. But this is where scholars sort of point to the emergence of like 3 different schools of Kabbalah. The first is theoretical, which is primarily philosophical and metaphysical. The second is meditative, which is kind of experiential and sometimes ecstatic. And then sometimes actually is sort of called the ecstatic school of Kabbalah. And then the third, practical Kabbalah, is up until fairly recently has sort of like been dismissed as sort of like, it's Kabbalistic magic. It's used by like a Ba'al Shem or like a hedge wizard to create amulets and medical magic and things like that. We'll talk about this a little bit. It really, really takes off a few centuries after this, but it's definitely sort of always there. A lot of like the mystical teachers would kind of, poo-poo it or say like, oh no, real mystics don't deal with practical Kabbalah. That's for peasants. All right, so I'm going to talk about a couple different people during this early period. First is Nachmanides, otherwise known as Ramban. A lot of rabbis get these really cool nicknames that are actually notaricon, or they're built on what's the English word? Acronyms. They're acronyms, right? So Moses ben Nachman, Rabbi Moses Nachman is RMBN, Ramban. He was a Talmudic scholar, and he actually received instruction in Kabbalah from somebody else, but then wrote about his mystical thoughts. And he was one of the first Kabbalists to sort of talk about humans as having like multiple souls. Maybe just 2 in his writings, but that starts to multiply as Kabbalah develops over the years. So he's sort of considered sort of like very early Kabbalistic thought and very rooted in theoretical Kabbalah. And then overlapping with him is one of my favorite Kabbalists, Abraham Abulafia. I love this. What I can get a hold of this guy, I really enjoy reading. He most of his work is still kept secret and still kept in like manuscript form and like secret Kabbalistic schools and Kabbalistic lineages. So we can't even get it. And even the stuff that isn't secret, a lot of it isn't translated into English, so it's really hard to get. He primarily lived in Spain and Italy. He was definitely like the progenitor of the ecstatic school of Kabbalah. His meditations and trances involved all of these involved like breath work and bodily movement that combined with the sounds he was making. This is also he was one of the early practicers of temura, or like the permutation method of looking at divine names, where you would take a name and you would chant it letter by letter, and then you would rearrange it and chant it again, and rearrange it and chant it again, and these chants would go on and on and on, with each letter sort of having its own bodily movements or its own breath patterns and things like that. It's pretty interesting stuff, and some of his meditations are translated in English, and you can find them and practice them. So they're interesting to experiment with. Okay, so then we start to get into something that can start to be recognized as like modern Kabbalah. I'm saying modern, even though it's still like 700 years ago. The Sefer HaZohar, or the Book of Splendor, was written in the 13th century, probably by Moses de Leon and a group of other Jewish scholars. It is a massive text. The most recent English translation that came out is like 12 enormous books, like really enormous books. And it is, I mean, with that much space, it's got room for a lot of things. First of all, it has multiple commentaries on the Torah. It has it has texts describing mystical visions. It has texts describing, myths and legends. It has, big passages about sort of like mystical, expositions and things like that. It's written in Aramaic, which is kind of interesting for something in the 13th century. And in the book itself, it's attributed to Shimon Bar Yochai, who was a 2nd century mystic who almost certainly did not actually write it. One of my favorite portions of the Sefer HaZohar is the Idra Rabbah, which we will talk about again later. And in this, Shimon Bar Yochai and a group of rabbis retreat to a cave and share these mystical visions of God that are among the strangest, almost like sci-fi filled visions that I've come across in mystical texts. The Sefer HaZohar was so important and remains so important that it's kind of seen as like the foundational text of Kabbalah, which will become really interesting as we go on and talk about some of the other branches of Kabbalah and the availability of the Zohar. But really, like without it, Kabbalah wouldn't exist. It's the book, and it's gone on to become almost like mainstream and accepted amongst some branches of Judaism, and is used in like just normal Shabbat services today. One of the things that was developed by the Zohar school was what they called the Pardes method of interpreting texts, where you had these different layers of meaning that could be found in a text. And this was used in looking at Torah and looking at other sacred texts and figuring out what was going on, and probably was also used in the writing of the Zohar, which meant that layers and layers of meaning were sort of embedded in this Kabbalistic text and later Kabbalistic texts. It really this sort of thing transforms Kabbalah into absolutely the nerdiest of esoteric traditions, the most cranial and analytic of all schools of mysticism, and it's kind of amazing. So you have these 4 layers: Peshat, which is the surface or literal reading of a text; Remez, which is looking for allegory; Darash, which is sort of looking for additional meaning; and then the Sod, which is the mystery or mystical secret hidden in the text. The Zohar also talks about the Sephirot, but doesn't actually use the word Sephirah or Sephirot, which sort of crops up a little bit later. And we'll see that it takes a little while for that concept to really be solidified. But you will notice that like one of the things that's still lacking or still missing in Kabbalah at this point are things like the tree of life and stuff like that. But another thing that happens in the Zohar is we get a more explicit discussion of kind of the layers of the soul. Nefesh, which in Torah is a word that means sort of like a whole human being, including the soul. Ruach, which is a word that also means like wind and spirit, which deals with like the emotional, moral faculties of human. And then Neshama, which in the Zohar is sort of like the highest level of the soul and deals with reasoning and divine wisdom and things like that. All right, so we go through then a couple of centuries where things are really confusing and difficult to track. But, ooh, that's way difficult to read. I hope people online can read that. In the 50s, yes?
Sorry, can I have like 10 more seconds for the last?
Oh, yeah. Oof.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I know it's there's a lot of it. This is definitely kind of a heavy information dump.
Three, just like there's so many.
Oh, we'll get up to 6.
Well, it's interesting that a lot of practice.
Yeah, it is. You got it? All right. Okay, so in the 15th century, in like the 1480s, during the height of the Florentine Renaissance, some Kabbalistic texts made their way to Florence, and primarily Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who had learned Hebrew, started to study Kabbalah. He took it in a way that nobody was really well, I mean, maybe he was expecting it, but he basically invented a whole new branch of Kabbalah called Christian Kabbalah, and it was sort of like weirdly incomplete. You know, the Christian Kabbalah of this time had no access to the Zohar, so they were mostly relying on other sort of like derivative works or derivative mystical texts. They were missing a lot of the concepts from the Zohar, but they still really latched on to a bunch of interesting stuff. There are 3 super important names in here, which I will zap with my laser pointer: Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Johann Reuchlin, and Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. Christian Kabbalah made the leap out of the Italian Renaissance, made it into the Northern Renaissance. Johann Reuchlin really embraced it and wrote a couple of books and had and kind of got in trouble for like not hating Jews. There was the Inquisition and the Dominicans were not very friendly then and were very anti-Semitic. And if you published books that were like, you know, Jews are okay, they'd come down on you and like you'd get punished. So he sort of had to do a lot of backpedaling. There's a lot of great stories about that. And then Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who wrote 3 books of occult philosophy, took a lot of Johann Reuchlin's writings and sort of presented them in a way that remained influential, still remains influential. But when you really take a look at what they were doing, it doesn't feel very much like the Kabbalah that we know today, that we get from like the Golden Dawn or anything like that. First of all, the Tree of Life is absent. The Sephirot are absent. In one of Reuchlin's books, he has a list of the names of the Sephirot, but he apparently has no concept of what they are, and he treats them as like the names of angels or something like that. They had no access to the Sefer HaZohar, so there's no concept of like this like deep mystical insight into Torah and that sort of thing. And there's no mapping of correspondences onto the Tree of Life, which is a really huge part of modern Kabbalah, especially Hermetic Qabalah. So the focus was kind of on hermeneutics, or using analysis of Hebrew to examine scripture and get a deeper understanding of scripture. In addition, both Agrippa and Reuchlin were kind of obsessed with like the divine names and their permutation of names, but also there's this interesting integration of math of number into the Hebrew alphabet, which means that you could use letters and numbers to calculate each other, which led to all of this stuff where you would calculate names from scripture and astrology and all these sorts of things. But primarily, both Reuchlin and Agrippa seem to treat Kabbalah as a hermeneutic tool for understanding scripture. Yes.
Question.
Yes.
So, with the numbers, is that gematria?
Yes, yeah. They didn't always use it like gematria, but yeah, that's definitely it. Yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah. So this led into Christian Kabbalah immediately fell into the auspices of the Christian polemical tradition. Polemics, or Christian polemics, is sort of like how the Catholic Church argued that other religions were wrong. And through this, Christian Kabbalah kind of takes on a really kind of like gross feeling, where it's like culturally insensitive at best, and it's blatantly anti-Semitic at its worst. It kind of got worse over time for a little while. It misappropriated and distorted Kabbalistic teachings so that they didn't really match what original Kabbalists would have meant by those things. It used theological manipulation instead of genuine dialogue to speak to people who belong to other faiths and traditions. And And it met with so much skepticism and resistance by Jewish communities and leaders that it kind of like died out fairly quickly. I mean, don't get me wrong. It didn't stop the Inquisition and the Dominicans and all those people from being total assholes to European Jews, but at least the sort of like perversion of their own traditions sort of died out fairly quickly after a couple centuries. But there's a couple of things that were kind of interesting here. The first is the Pentagrammaton. You can kind of, whoops, that's not, it's on the bottom. There we go. Right here you can see the Pentagrammaton, which is basically the Hebrew four-letter name of God with an extra letter stuck in the middle that Christian Kabbalists claimed perfected the word and made it spell Jesus. It doesn't spell Jesus, but that was their claim. And that sort of shows up. You'll see that in a lot of Hermetic Qabalah as well. So the Christian polemical tradition, continue, especially their appropriation of Kabbalah and Christian Kabbalah, continued for a long time. But luckily, they didn't get a hold of some of the coolest stuff in Kabbalah, which we are going to turn to now. We're going to talk about Safed. This is a city in northern Israel. It was Ottoman Palestine at the time in the 16th century. This city wasn't big back then in the 16th century. It was just a little town, but it had more than its share of incredible mystics passing through and living there. It continues to be kind of an important city both for Kabbalah and Judaism to this day. But we're going to start with one of my favorite Kabbalists, Moses Cordovero, otherwise known as Ramak. He wrote a couple of really influential books, Tomer Devorah, or Palm Tree of Deborah, which is a book about sort of like ethics and mysticism. And then Pardes Rimonim, which is another one of those really, really enormous books that translates as Garden of Pomegranates and sort of outlines his entire sort of mystical system of Kabbalah. He wrote about both the Sephirot and the Kelipot, or Qlifoth, as you might have heard. And he also started to sort of refer to the Sephirot as sort of tools of like divine emanation and creation, and talked about how they were sort of the way that the infinite light of God flows into and sustains the finite world of creation. So these are sort of like mystical ideas that sound a lot more like modern Kabbalah. And Cordovero, he was a very influential and continues to be influential. His thoughts and writings are very important for understanding Kabbalah, but he's probably more well known for his star pupil, Isaac Luria, otherwise known as Ha'ari, or the Lion of Kabbalah. Luria didn't write anything down. All that we have from Luria was recorded by his student Chaim Vital, like a decade after Luria's death. But Luria talked about all of the cool mystical stuff that ended up like kind of defining how people think of Jewish Kabbalah today. First, Tzimtzum, which is this idea that God contracted his infinite light to create a vacant space into which the finite world was sort of injected. The Shevirat HaKelim, or the shattering of the vessels, which is the idea is that during the process of creation, the divine vessels that were intended to contain the divine light shattered, which led to a cosmic rupture and a scattering of all of these holy sparks of creation. Those are the Kelipot or Qlifoth. Tikkun Olam, or the repair of creation, which is the responsibility of any mystic or any magician, or indeed any human, to perform right actions and perform ethically and kindly in order to gather and rejoin all of the scattered sparks to rectify a cosmic order. Like that's basically like the ultimate goal of the mystic. Gilgul, which is transmigration of the soul or reincarnation. And then finally, the Sephirot and Partsufim, which are a little bit more complex, but the Sephirot, which we've already talked about, are those spheres, the divine emanations. Partsufim are faces or personas, which were kind of like groupings of Sephirot to try to understand how God could appear or how God could be presented to people. This diagram over here, this thing might be running out of juice. It's true. There we go. This diagram over here is Isaac Luria's Tree of Life, which you will notice does not look a whole lot like a tree, but the words up above are Ein and Ein Sof, which is limitless light and limitlessness. And then you can't really see, but in the concentric circles, there are all these little words, which are the names of the Sephirot leading up to Ein Sof Hour, which I guess that actually means limitless light, doesn't it? But you'll see that one of the things that's really interesting about this is the Tzimtzum is sort of present. That's that sort of vague white line that runs from the top all the way down to the middle. And then the Tree of Life is sort of presented in a very inside-out manner than we see it in other traditions. I know that this is a little technical. If it's too technical, you can stop me and ask. Yes.
Like more connections and questions.
Yes.
You mentioned the little line.
Yeah.
So is that like I am with Jacob's ladder or whatever, or is that?
We'll get to that. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It does. I don't know if Luria ever. I've only.
It's the connection from the divine to the human in one step, which includes all of the Sephirot in their manifestations in a direct race-like manner. If you wanted to be dirty. Yeah.
It definitely caused a little bit of an explosion.
It's the divine connection, right? It's the being. It's another way to say what he just said.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's kind of like your HGA coming down and connecting. Not like the same, but that, you know what I'm saying?
Well,
yeah. If you think of like,
it's just a different type of vocabulary that I'm using, so that it's just.
Yeah.
Except your HGA is just like level 4.
But it's
yeah.
It's a little bit dirty the way I did that.
Yeah.
Like it's quick and dirty.
Yeah. There's no way to.
There's more.
Yeah.
There's way more.
The only way to understand Isaac Luria is quick and dirty. His writings are, his teachings are voluminous and super, super difficult to follow. But these are kind of like the things you can boil out of it.
That's a zing.
A zing?
Zing.
Okay, so we're going to exit the 16th century and enter into the 17th century now. We're just going to spend so the 17th century for Jewish Kabbalah was kind of crazy. There were a lot of characters, none of whom had as much impact as Cordovero and Ha'ari, so we're not really going to talk about them. The big one is this guy here, Sabbatai Tzvi. He was. You should write down his name and look him up because I can't give his story full credit in the amount of time I have. But he claimed to be the Messiah. He gathered a huge following that lasted for like a century after his death. It was called the Sabbatean movement. He was forced to convert to Islam in 1666 and sort of, died in obscurity in Constantinople or Istanbul, whatever it was then. But his followers continued for years and years and years. But in the 17th century, he was not the only Kabbalist to claim to be the Messiah. There are people who are claiming to be tzaddikim, who are sort of like these superhero holy men. People claim to be the Messiah. This is also sort of the time when practical Kabbalah started to spread across Eastern Europe, which was kind of this, I guess, you would call it sort of like hedge magic sort of way of using Hebrew and Kabbalistic techniques to do, sort of, like Braucherei style magic. Not Braucherei, I shouldn't have said that, but that kind of like village magic kind of stuff. And then the Christian Kabbalah kind of really began to wind down, or at least the polemical side of it in this century, which was cool because it opened up some space for some more exciting characters, including scientific superhuman Athanasius Kircher. Kircher is known for a lot of really, really strange things and weird beliefs. He sort of thought he figured out how to interpret hieroglyphs, like Egyptian hieroglyphs, and he did not. Spoiler alert. He sort of believed that Hebrew wisdom predated Egyptian wisdom, and that's why he was able to interpret the hieroglyphs, is because he knew Hebrew. So he's like, I'll just pretend that didn't work. He, in his studies of Kabbalah, he became really obsessed with the permutation of words and combined it with the Lolian arts of Ramon Lol, which sort of developed into its own sort of interesting type of mysticism. And then he also developed what's came to be known as the Kircher Tree of Life, which, if you've ever looked at any Golden Dawn stuff, you have certainly seen. This is the Athanasius Kircher version of the Tree of Life, which has continued on into Hermetic Qabalah, but doesn't really get used very much in Jewish Kabbalah. You can look this up online and get a much higher resolution image of it. I know that this is a little difficult to see, but you can see the 10 spheres. You can see way up at the top the Ein Sof. You can see a bunch of other things in there, lots of very tiny Hebrew words. And then the other character, an even more important one that I think deserves way more attention, is Christian Nor von Rosenroth. He was kind of a cool guy. He studied with rabbis in Amsterdam, and he translated portions of the Zohar for the very first time into a European language, into Latin. So this was the first time that the Zohar actually started to become available to Europeans who were not Jewish, or actually probably even those who were Jewish, because the Zohar was written in Aramaic, and who the heck ever speaks Aramaic? So this book that the Kabbalah Denudata, or Kabbalah Revealed, was not really just the Zohar, but it was a collection of a lot of later Jewish works, including stuff by Isaac Luria. Kircher thought that Kabbalah could prove the doctrines of Christianity, but he didn't approach it in a polemic sense. Like, he wasn't using it to try to convert anybody or be an asshole. Like, rabbis taught him how to look at the stuff and how to do it. He believed that Adam Kadmon, otherwise known as the primordial man in Isaac Luria's work, was analogous to Jesus Christ, and the supernal Sephirot, I can go back, and those 3 circles at the top of the Tree of Life were equivalent to the Holy Trinity. So he basically reached beyond the Christian Kabbalah material that he had available to look at actual Jewish sources. And honestly, without Nor von Rosenroth, we would not have the Golden Dawn, we would not have Thelema, we would not have Hermetic Qabalah at all. And then in the Dictionary of Gnosis and Western Esotericism, it has this little quote: the KD is not simply a book, but rather the title of an entire library of Kabbalistic literature. Only the first section of the Kabbalah Denudata was translated and used by the Golden Dawn also. So there's a lot left out there that hasn't really been looked at in a long time. I'm just saying, maybe somebody should do that. Yeah, somebody should translate it. All right, so during this time, Jewish Kabbalah had sort of started to become a little bit more mainstream and had developed into an accepted part of modern Judaism. We're going to look at the Hasidic movement, which is originally Kabbalistic. We won't really talk a whole lot about Musar, but that developed in the 19th century. I already mentioned how the Zohar kind of became a little mainstream and accepted into various branches of modern Judaism. But we do have some pretty impactful groups. The Yeshiva Beit El, or the School of the House of God, was founded by Rabbi Gedalia Chayan. They were the first to print Sefer Otz Chaim, which is the book that contains all of Isaac Luria's stuff. So the first time it was actually in print was apparently in 1866. This school continues today, and it has multiple locations in Israel. The next is Hasidic Judaism, which was founded by the Ba'al Shem Tov, or Master of the Good Name, whose real name I did not write down and I cannot remember. He was a practicer of sort of like practical or magical Kabbalah, but he started a whole mystical school that turned into a pretty big Jewish movement that still exists. And it's sort of like, everybody knows what Hasidic Jews look like now, and their rabbis are Kabbalists. Their primary meditative practice is prayer, and that's sort of, you can look them up and learn a lot about them. But now we're going to get into everybody's favorite, Hermetic Qabalah. I'm sorry that you can't see this hilarious little meme down here, but the crow is standing on stage and he's like, what does he say? We should combine Kabbalah with witchcraft. We should combine Kabbalah with blah, 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 blah. And they're yelling at him, get better material. And all of his cards are like, we should combine Kabbalah with this. It's making fun of Hermetic Qabalah, which is something that's pretty easy to do once you get a little bit more history than the 19th century had available to it. Hermetic Qabalah was part of the 19th century occult revival, and it turned into the California burrito of occultism. Like, everything is in there. Like, you look in a California burrito and it's got like French fries, and you're like, why? And Hermetic Qabalah kind of ends up like that. The more you look into it, you're like, why is this in here? And it just is, and everybody just accepts it now. So there's Jewish Kabbalah, there's Christian mysticism, there's Hermeticism, and with it along came alchemy. There's astrology, which was always in Kabbalah, but not this kind of astrology. And then, most excitingly, and probably most familiar to everybody who's looked at Hermetic Qabalah, tarot. And this whole mess started, this whole mess started with Pico della Mirandola, but the modern mess started with Eliphas Levi and his book, Dogma and Ritual of High Magic. He was the first one to link together tarot and Kabbalah. And he kind of started to go a little crazy with correspondences on the Tree of Life, which is something that the founders of the Golden Dawn leapt all over, like a tiger on a wounded zebra. They ate that shit up. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn is probably mostly well known for being like the foundation of most 20th century ceremonial magic. Hermetic Qabalah is at the core of their system and is kind of the glue that ties everything together. And their most famous symbol is an excellent example of this. If you look at the rose cross symbol on the left, you have at the very center Rosicrucian rose cross symbol, which is Christian mysticism, Protestant mysticism specifically. Around it, you have the mothers, doubles, and elementals of the Hebrew alphabet in those petals, which is Sefer Yetzirah stuff, like pre-Kabbalistic mysticism. Around that, you have around the outside in the white spikes, INRI, which is a mystical formula that was used in esoteric branches of Freemasonry that's also tied to Christian mysticism. At the ends of the branches, where you have sort of those three lobes in every direction, you have alchemical symbols for the alchemical primary elements. Like, they shoved everything possible into Hermetic Qabalah and tried to get everything to kind of like glue together through it. They have, in their rituals, they merge together Egyptian gods. They merge together the Greek magical papyri that they could get a hold of at the time. They merge together Hinduism, Christian syncretism, like everything they could get in a crazy mix of stuff. They used the works of Nor von Rosenroth and the Kabbalah Denudata, which was translated as the Kabbalah Unveiled. They used the works of Eliphas Levi. They used grimoires, as many as they could find and get a hold of. They integrated a lot of Christian Kabbalah, including like the Pentagrammaton. And then they sort of hoovered up everything that the British Empire had contact with, which kind of in a way sort of makes a lot of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn's ritual feel a little colonizing sometimes when you look at some of their charts. They really appropriated. They didn't know the word cultural appropriation, let's put it that way. Yeah. So is it problematic? It might be. It's, you know, you have to sort of view it through their lens, I suppose. It feels problematic to me sometimes. Is it confusing? Yes, it is. But most works that you will get today written in English dealing with Kabbalah are related to Hermetic Qabalah, even if they do strip away some of the other stuff. And in fact, some of the best Hermetic Qabalah stuff that you'll find these days deals with tarot and the Hermetic Qabalah. So that's some of the, I think, most profound sort of Hermetic Qabalah spiritual stuff you'll find these days. But Hermetic Qabalah wasn't done. Next came along Aleister Crowley. I don't have time to cover the entirety of Crowley, but he sort of used the Golden Dawn system and Hermetic Qabalah to kind of influence and build his new religion, Thelema. He also authored some really, really influential and still kind of amazing works on Hermetic Qabalah, like 777, which is right here on the shelf if anybody wants to get a copy. And he also, you know, through Crowley and probably through the controversy he caused, he really helped give the Golden Dawn a wider impact that sort of carried into the modern world. Dion Fortune is the next we'll talk about. She was also attached to the Golden Dawn and founded a Golden Dawn branch called the Society of the Inner Light. And she wrote a book called The Mystical Kabbalah that kind of remains possibly the most common starter book for people who are learning Hermetic Qabalah today. You'll notice that this is the first female, the first woman's name we've seen in this whole talk. Kabbalah has sort of always been a very heavily male-dominated tradition, and you don't really see a whole lot of female influence showing up until, you know, maybe the Sabbateans had some, but until like the 20th century, which is, you know. Anyhow, so yeah, Dion Fortune, her works are still really influential and widely read. Mystical Kabbalah, probably first among them. She's a little racist, but not super racist. Kind of about like average level of racism for the time. Next, Israel Regardie, also probably a really well-known name. He was the one who published the rituals and teachings of the Golden Dawn. I'm sure you've all seen the giant black book that Llewellyn puts out. Without him, we wouldn't really have modern Golden Dawn orders. But he was really into the Hermetic Qabalah stuff, and he wrote a number of books that are pretty amazing. Garden of Pomegranates, which shares a name with Moses Cordevero's book, but is not the same. Another really incredible and very digestible book called The Middle Pillar, which is worth reading. And then The Tree of Life, which has some Kabbalah in it, but it's basically, the Tree of Life is sort of the ideal form of the Hermetic Qabalah blender. Like, it's got everything in it. It's a big book. It's got lots of stuff. Another thing that Israel Regardie was really influential in was integrating psychology into magic. You know, psychology was still a fairly young science at the time, and it's probably through Israel Regardie's influence that the psychological model of modern magic kind of developed. I'm not sure if we should thank him for that, since I think it's really hampered a lot of magical development, but at the same time, without it, a lot of occult theory and occult traditions probably would have died out. All right, so you'll notice that Rigardi passed away in 1985, but never fear, Kabbalah is not a dead tradition. There's still lots of fun stuff going on, lots of amazing scholarship, modern mystics, modern people doing cool stuff. One of my favorites, Aryeh Kaplan, was a physicist before he became an Orthodox rabbi. He translated a number of really important mystical texts, Kabbalistic texts, and pre-Kabbalistic texts in English, including the Sefer Yetzirah. In fact, his translation of the Sefer Yetzirah, the commentary on it is a primer on Lurianic Kabbalah. So you'll read it, and you won't really get a primer on pre-Kabbalistic mysticism as much as you will Lurianic Kabbalah. It's an incredible book. It took me 3 tries to read over many years because it was very difficult. His work is definitely worth checking out. Zev ben Shimon Halevi was one of the founding members of the Kabbalah Society and part of the Toledano tradition of Kabbalah. He wrote a number of books that were really excellent. He does an amazing job sort of describing Jewish Kabbalah and explaining it in a way that like any of us could understand. The best one is The Way of Kabbalah. If you want to get started with one of his books, I would suggest The Way of Kabbalah. One of the things his tradition is most well known for is developing a new model of the 4 Kabbalistic worlds, which I'm not going to go into. There's a very, very incredibly tiny picture of it there. The big surprise is that they overlap, which when he describes it, it's way more profound than that. In the Hermetic Qabalah world, we have people like William Gray, who was the founder of the Sangreal Sodality. He developed a really interesting English language version of Hermetic Qabalah that tried to like really simplify a lot of the stuff in it. His book, Kabbalistic Concepts, is a really good primer on Hermetic Qabalah without getting too bogged down in all of the additions and syncretisms that like Israel Rigardi was obsessed with. So that's an interesting book to start with. It'll get you pretty far away from Jewish Kabbalah, but it will you won't have to learn a new alphabet and a new language. So that makes it a little easier. And then finally, our friend, everybody's friend, Lon Milo Duquette, or Rabbi Lamed Ben Clifford. He is the Deputy Grand Master of the Ordo Templi Orientis for the United States. His books, The Chicken Kabbalah of Rabbi Lamed Ben Clifford and Son of Chicken Kabbalah, are humor-filled and hilarious and use a lot of, I think, easily graspable metaphor to describe and explain a lot of really difficult Kabbalistic concepts. I think it's a pretty good introduction to both Hermetic and maybe Jewish Kabbalah, although it's a little irreverent, and I have known some traditional Kabbalists who have been kind of offended by the book, but you know, we used it when we went through it.
I thought the inside jokes were great.
I did too. There's a hilarious thing that sort of like explains the different layers of creation using an elevator in a department store. I thought that was hilarious. He's had these books have been really, really popular, and they're like 20 years old, I think. And they've had a huge influence on Hermetic Qabalah and modern Kabbalah. So they're definitely worth checking out, even if you hate them.
If you don't like jokes.
If you don't like jokes, then
The father of the sufferer of silliness.
yeah.
It's
Yes.
new,
The jokes,
but it isn't really.
Yeah.
maybe if you're not reading the jokes, you're not. I think
think
it
you-
makes it so you remember things.
Yeah, definitely.
It's like adding music.
I think so too. And then finally, a lot of the stuff that I was able to talk about today is thanks to scholarship, like scholars of Kabbalah. So some of these people are mystics, but like Gershom Scholem and Moshe Idel, they don't really shove any of their religious beliefs in your face. They're just sort of like, here's some history, here's some breakdowns of stuff. They're both incredible. Gershom Scholem is, I think, probably the first Kabbalistic scholar that I read, and it was like the most effective fish hook ever. Like, it totally snagged me. I love his stuff.
Opening doors of light.
Yeah, it opened a lot of doors of light. Moshe Idel is a little bit more academic, but his stuff is also really interesting, and he dives into a lot of topics that religious scholars in like Christian traditions don't really like touching, like sexuality, things like that. Daniel C. Matt, now he's definitely a mystic, but he keeps his public stuff pretty, we'll just cut to the chase. Daniel C. Matt, he translated the Zohar into English. He's a friggin' superhero. He's amazing. He's a superhero. He's one of those brains that you'll never meet anybody like him.
Unless you meet him.
Yeah. And then Jill Hammer is, she just recently published a new translation of the Sefer Yetzirah that's supposed to be really amazing. And she does a lot of work with sort of like, modern Kabbalah scholars. Yeah. So those are all really people who are really worth checking out. Yeah, I think I did that in record time. Did I talk fast? I must have. So thank you.
Yeah,
So
it was
you
clear.
spoke clearly.
I would love to get a copy of the
Of this-
slide, just because I didn't take any notes.
All right. Well, you can, if you email me,
Arnemancy.
I'll get you a copy of the slides. Are there any questions? Are there online questions? There must be online questions. I'm mostly visible. I need to get a light.
I have a lot to say, but I listen.
Sean, do you think there's anything that is important that I left out?
That was a really brilliant overview.
All right.
I would say that if anyone was to take a few notes on those names,
Yeah.
that they would be well served to have enough reading for the next 25 years. So be careful what you wish for. If you do,
Let's see. So Missy asks, do we have a copy of the slides? I'll make a copy of the slides and send them to Steve, and then he'll be able to get them to everybody who signed up. Are there any other questions? I know I zoomed through some of that stuff real fast.
so
Would anybody like me to make fun of the Golden Dawn some more?
I think that it took me a long time to realize how the circles and the Sephiroth charts that are differing are
Mhm.
actually describing the same thing. And I would like to mention that you should also look into Illinot as something to, if you do get into this to the level where you are, then you might, there's another whole level of describing your spiritual journey on a diagram that
Mhm.
creates your own life cloak, I would say, of spiritual understanding of Kabbalah.
And what tradition is that from?
From the Jewish mystical tradition.
That's not one tradition. Like, wait, who taught it? You just making this
I'm
up?
not making this up.
Making it up?
What is it called? We can look it up real quick.
I look up ILANOT. Look that up.
Okay.
And then have fun.
All right.
The rest of your life. But
Well, I got into Musar instead, which was a whole another school of Kabbalistic weirdness. So.
I have a book to share with you.
Okay. Well, it looks like there aren't any more questions online. Are there any questions here? Does anybody have any questions? All right.
Great job.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks. Thank you,
that was
everybody.
great. That was- It definitely did inspire me.
Bye, online people. I hope you had a good time.